Imagine a vibrant Indonesia with a unique culture full of traditions, art, and customs that flourished long before the arrival of colonizers. In this video, we'll dive into a little explored world where each cultural detail reveals the essence of a society that built its own stories and identities. What was this original culture of Indonesia like before the Dutch arrived? And what can we learn by rediscovering it today? In this content, we'll explore Indonesia's indigenous legacy before any foreign influence. We'll understand how the traditions, spiritual practices, and way of life of Indonesians reflect a rich history marked by a connection to nature, spirituality, and collective creativity. Are you curious to see how these cultural roots still resonate in modern Indonesia? If you've ever wondered what remains authentic in a country that underwent centuries of colonization, this video is for you. Here, you'll not only learn about the past, you'll gain a new perspective on Indonesia's cultural identity and resilience. Introduction and historical context of pre-colonial Indonesia. Indonesia, with its thousands of islands and strategic location between the Indian and Pacific Oceans, boasts a rich, complex cultural history that spans thousands of years. Long before European colonizers arrived, the region was already a thriving center of cultural and commercial exchanges. This introduction to Indonesia's past offers a glimpse of a society that, well before colonization, had developed its own cultural identities, social systems, and unique spiritual practices. Each island, with its tribes and ethnic groups, contributed to a vast, diverse cultural mosaic united by shared values of respect for nature and deeply rooted traditions. A fundamental aspect of this history is Indonesia's geographical location, which made it a meeting point for different Asian civilizations. Proximity to India, China, and other parts of Southeast Asia enabled Indonesia to absorb major religious and philosophical traditions like Hinduism, Buddhism, and eventually Islam. Yet these external influences didn't erase the indigenous identity. Instead, Indonesian communities adapted them, integrating foreign elements while respecting their own traditions. In this way, Indonesia developed a unique identity, marked by cultural fusion that continued to evolve autonomously over the centuries. Through this series, we'll better understand how these cultures, with their unique practices and value systems, were shaped and later challenged by colonial presence. Each main island in the archipelago, Java, Sumatra, Bali, and Borneo, held unique cultural and economic traits that contributed to a prosperous and self-sufficient Indonesia. There were internal trade structures and even international trade routes with products like spices, textiles, and other valuable items, positioning Indonesia as a key player in the Asian economy. This prosperity attracted traders and travelers long before the Dutch arrived. As we move forward, the importance of knowing this authentic, culturally rich Indonesia will become increasingly clear. This knowledge allows the viewer to understand how deep the colonial impact was, affecting a society that was already complex and prosperous. The first step in understanding this impact is to see Indonesia as a dynamic and independent cultural center with a history that deserves exploration for its intrinsic value, not just as a prelude to colonization. Culture and society in pre-colonial Indonesia. Before the arrival of colonizers, Indonesian society was built on a strong communal foundation that reflected the diversity of peoples and cultures spread throughout the archipelago. Each island was home to various ethnic groups, each with its own customs, languages, and organizational systems. This plurality was seen as a source of wealth and, at the same time, a challenge, as a system of norms and practices was needed to allow for coexistence and cooperation among different communities. Social unity and harmony were fundamental values, ensuring stability and continuous development in the region. Pre-colonial Indonesian social systems were characterized by a strong presence of local leaders and community organizations. Many groups adopted a decentralized governance model, where local leaders or clan chiefs acted as mediators and representatives of their community's needs and traditions. These leaders not only held political authority, but also often had a spiritual role, being regarded as figures of wisdom and connection with the spiritual world. Social structure was based on a hierarchical system that valued respect for elders and cooperation among members of the same community. For instance, in Java, there were kingdoms such as Majapahit, which, in addition to establishing a prosperous trade network, also fostered a highly refined and organized culture. This kingdom promoted the development of the arts, literature, and a governance system that influenced the entire region. The Javanese had a strong cultural tradition reflected in their music, dance, and forms of artistic expression. Culture was passed down orally from generation to generation, and educating and nurturing the younger members was seen as a shared community responsibility. Other islands, like Sumatra and Bali, also had rich cultures and their own social systems. In Sumatra, the Kingdom of Srivijaya was a Buddhist learning center that attracted scholars and pilgrims from various parts of Asia. In Bali, society was heavily influenced by Hinduism, which shaped people's daily lives, from religious rituals to community celebrations. Religious life directly influenced social organization, where the collective was seen as more important than the individual, and community work was essential for everyone's well-being. Communication among the different communities and ethnic groups was facilitated by internal trade, which linked the archipelago in a network of cultural and economic exchanges. Products like rice, textiles, spices, and ceramics circulated among the islands, not only promoting economic growth, but also enabling cultural exchange. This internal trade was a vital part of pre-colonial Indonesian life, as it not only ensured the community's livelihood, but also strengthened bonds of solidarity and collective identity among different peoples. In addition to trade exchanges, music and dance were also powerful forms of communication and cultural expression. Nearly every community had its own music, with traditional instruments like the gamelan, which has become a cultural icon still recognized today. Ritual dances and celebrations were not only entertainment, but also means of reinforcing cultural identity and recounting the ancestral stories of the community. Many Indonesian dances carry spiritual symbolism, seen as a way of honoring ancestors and seeking protection for the community. Public ceremonies reinforced communal values and created a sense of unity that transcended regional differences. This complex social structure, based on cooperation, respect, and collective responsibility, formed the foundation of pre-colonial Indonesia. By exploring how people lived, celebrated, and worked together in community, it becomes clear that Indonesian culture was built on pillars that prioritize collectivity and mutual respect. These values, deeply ingrained in society, help communities resist external influences and, later, withstand the cultural imposition of colonizers. The resilience of these traditions shows how rich and multifaceted Indonesian identity was long before the arrival of Europeans. Understanding these cultural aspects offers a new perspective to the viewer, revealing that Indonesian society was neither passive nor disorganized, as some historical narratives might suggest. On the contrary, it was an organized society fully aware of its role within a larger network of cultural and economic influences. In the next chapter, we'll explore how this spiritual connection with nature manifested itself and was integrated into everyday life. We'll understand that, for Indonesians, the natural environment was not merely a resource, but a sacred and essential element for spiritual and social balance. Indonesian spirituality and connection with nature. Spirituality was one of the most significant forces shaping everyday life in pre-colonial Indonesia. Different Indonesian peoples and ethnic groups maintained a profound relationship with the natural environment, where nature was revered as sacred, with each element holding spiritual significance. For many communities, mountains, rivers, and forests were inhabited by ancestral spirits who, according to their beliefs, protected the people and ensured the community's harmony and prosperity. Nature, therefore, was not seen merely as a resource, but as a living extension of human existence, creating an essential link between the physical and spiritual worlds. This respect for nature was reflected in rituals and practices that celebrated the elements and honored the spirits Indonesians believed inhabited the land. In various parts of the archipelago, seasonal ceremonies were held to give thanks for the harvests and pray for favorable rains, symbolizing a relationship of respect and reciprocity with nature. These practices reinforced a sense of connection between the communities and the environment, promoting a mindset of preservation and collective responsibility. Thus, the relationship with the environment was much more than a matter of survival. It was a cultural and spiritual expression that gave Indonesian society its unique character. In Bali, for instance, Balinese Hinduism adapted deeply to the island environment, incorporating practices that honored the gods of nature and ancestral spirits. The Balinese built temples in natural settings, such as mountains and beaches, believing these places were inhabited by divine beings. The concept of Tri-Hita Karana, meaning three sources of well-being, guided the Balinese relationship with the world, balancing their connection with God, the community, and nature. This balance was considered essential to well-being, both individually and collectively, and it guided how the Balinese interacted with their environment. Another example is the animist practices in some communities on the island of Sumatra, where ancestral beliefs were preserved even as other religions, such as Islam, gained influence. These communities held specific rituals to honor the protective spirits of nature, like ceremonies performed in forests or near rivers, considered sacred places. These rituals symbolize the importance of preserving the natural environment, with the belief that its degradation or disrespect would disrupt the community's harmony and bring negative consequences. Pre-colonial Indonesian spirituality also manifested in art and daily life. Many symbols, ornaments, and sculptures were inspired by nature's figures and elements, serving as representations of the spiritual forces governing the world. The gamelan, a traditional Indonesian musical instrument, was often played in religious ceremonies and rituals, with the music seen as a form of communication with the divine. Likewise, dance played a spiritual role, serving as a symbolic expression that connected the community to the spiritual universe, while also reinforcing local cultural identity. For Indonesians, the environment was not something to be conquered or exploited without limits, but rather an entity with which one should live in harmony. This deep respect for nature meant that sustainable practices were incorporated into daily life. Whether in agriculture, where farming techniques respected natural cycles, or in fishing, which was conducted in ways that prevented overexploitation. This mindset of respect and environmental balance was one of the foundations that supported Indonesian culture before colonization, creating a society where spirituality and nature were intrinsically connected. By understanding this spiritual view, the viewer can appreciate that pre-colonial Indonesia had a relationship with the natural world that went beyond the material. This perspective becomes even more meaningful when we consider the consequences of colonization, which imposed a different and often aggressive worldview toward the environment. In the next chapter, we'll examine how this spiritual relationship was expressed through Indonesian art and architecture, and how these visual expressions were much more than simple decorations. They were ways to keep the connection with the divine and the cultural identity of each community alive. Art and architecture before colonization. Indonesian art and architecture were deeply connected to the spiritual and cultural traditions of the diverse communities across the archipelago. Before the arrival of colonizers, artistic creation in Indonesia served as a means of connecting with the spiritual realm and preserving ancestral beliefs and histories. Sculptures, paintings, temples, and various structures were imbued with symbolism, and every detail had a greater purpose than mere decoration. These visual elements were considered portals to the divine, carrying spiritual and cultural meanings that reinforced collective identity. Architecture, for instance, mirrored the social organization and spiritual beliefs of the people. In Java, where kingdoms like Majapahit flourished, Buddhist and Hindu temples were built in harmony with the natural surroundings, symbolizing a fusion between the sacred and the earthly. The renowned Borobudur Temple, a 9th century Buddhist monument, exemplifies this integration. Designed to represent the Buddhist cosmos, Borobudur's mandala-like structure symbolizes the path to enlightenment. Carved with thousands of reliefs and Buddha figures, Borobudur is not only an architectural marvel, but also an expression of Javanese spirituality, drawing devotees and visitors in search of a transcendent experience even today. In Bali, temple architecture and decoration followed similar principles, with a strong Hindu influence adapted to the island's natural landscape. Balinese temples, with their tiered towers and detailed ornamentation, are constructed from natural materials, such as volcanic stone and wood, to create aesthetic and spiritual harmony with the island. Each architectural element serves as a tribute to the gods and nature, reflecting the principle of Tri-Hita Karana, the pursuit of balance among humans, the environment, and the spiritual world. These temples were, and still are, sacred spaces for celebration and religious practice, where the Balinese could connect with divine forces and strengthen their sense of community. Art, too, was a powerful expression of Indonesian cultural identity. Sculptures and masks were created in various regions, such as Java, Bali, and Sumatra, each with distinctive styles and purposes. These sculptures often depicted gods, ancestral spirits, or mythical figures, and were used in religious ceremonies and festivals to attract blessings and ward off evil spirits. The presence of these artistic figures in villages and temples reinforced the sacredness of daily life and the cultural identity of local groups. Additionally, sculpture and painting served as a means of storytelling and myth preservation, educating new generations about their origins and values. A prominent aspect of Indonesian artistic expression was dance. Each movement in traditional dances carried specific symbolism, with dancers becoming, in essence, conduits between the physical and spiritual worlds. Dance was a symbolic language that transcended entertainment. It was a form of prayer and gratitude, maintaining the spiritual connection and strengthening cultural identity. In Bali, the Barong dance, which represents the struggle between good and evil, exemplifies this connection. It not only entertained the community, but also promoted unity and taught moral and spiritual values. In pre-colonial Indonesia, art and architecture were not merely created to be viewed, but to be lived and felt as extensions of spirituality and cultural identity. These visual and performative expressions were part of a way of life that valued the connection between the sacred and the everyday, resisting attempts at cultural imposition brought by colonization. This understanding of art and architecture as forms of spirituality offers viewers a glimpse into how Indonesian communities preserved and transmitted their traditions and values across generations, keeping their cultural roots alive in every carved piece, performed dance, or erected temple. Understanding this cultural and spiritual dimension is essential to grasping the cultural resilience Indonesia demonstrated throughout its history. In the next chapter, we'll explore how the archipelago's economy and trade flourished before European arrival, revealing an economically prosperous society connected to the Asian world long before any colonial influence. Commerce and economy in pre-colonial Indonesia. Pre-colonial Indonesia was a dynamic and prosperous economic center, largely due to its strategic location along the maritime trade routes connecting the Indian and Pacific Oceans. This position made the archipelago a vital stop for traders from various parts of the world, including India, China, the Middle East, and even East Africa. This steady flow of goods and ideas turned Indonesia into a hub of commercial and cultural exchange, allowing the local economy to thrive long before European colonizers arrived. The region's primary economic wealth lay in its spices. Products like cloves, nutmeg, pepper, and cinnamon were highly valued in international markets and attracted traders who journeyed long distances to obtain them. The Maluku Islands, also known as the Spice Islands, became especially famous for producing cloves and nutmeg, rare and precious items of the time. The high demand for these spices enabled local communities to develop a strong, independent economy based on both internal trade and exports. In addition to spices, Indonesia also produced other goods that became integral to its trade with neighboring countries. Products like textiles, gold, gemstones, and ceramics were highly valued and widely traded within and beyond the archipelago. In Java and Sumatra, rice cultivation and the production of cotton and silk fabrics became important economic activities that strengthened the local economy. Internal markets for exchanging and selling these products not only ensured community subsistence, but also promoted wealth circulation and cooperation across different regions. Economic prosperity was also closely tied to the organized commercial systems of Indonesian communities, which developed well-structured and integrated trade networks. Key ports were established on various main islands, where foreign merchants could exchange goods and interact with local populations. These ports were administered by local leaders and, in many cases, also overseen by religious authorities, who ensured the security and integrity of trade agreements. This structure allowed commerce to flourish and enabled local communities to control their own economic activities without interference from external powers. Trade exchanges also spurred significant cultural exchange, as merchants from different regions brought not only goods but also ideas, beliefs, and customs. This made Indonesia a melting pot of cultural influences that blended with local traditions, enriching society further. For example, contact with Muslim traders from the Middle East was one of the factors that introduced Islam to parts of Indonesia, which eventually became the predominant religion in the archipelago, adapted to local customs and values. This prosperous, interconnected economy offered Indonesia stability and autonomy, making it a regional power. Through trade, local communities were able to meet their needs and accumulate wealth while preserving their traditions and autonomy. It was a self-sufficient economy that promoted a network of mutual cooperation and cultural strengthening among the various islands and ethnicities of the archipelago. This period of economic prosperity is a testament to the Indonesians' ability to build a functional and cohesive society without reliance on foreign powers. However, this wealth and commercial independence also attracted the attention of European colonizers, who saw the archipelago as an opportunity to expand their own economies and gain access to these valuable resources. The arrival of Europeans and their attempts to control trade routes and spice production would lead to a drastic transformation of Indonesia's economy and social structure. In the next chapter, we'll examine the cultural and spiritual impact of Dutch colonization, analyzing how European presence profoundly altered the balance and way of life in local communities. Cultural and spiritual impact of Dutch colonization. The arrival of the Dutch and subsequent colonization marked a turning point for Indonesia, deeply affecting the way of life, social organization, and spirituality of local communities. The Dutch, aiming to establish direct control over the lucrative trade routes and spice sources, quickly imposed a system of domination that drastically altered the archipelago's economic and cultural structures. This process not only exploited the local population, but also introduced a different worldview, negatively impacting Indonesia's cultural and spiritual fabric. One of the first changes was the imposition of a centralized power structure, with the Dutch East India Company, VOC, taking control over trade routes and key ports across the archipelago. This economic control included the exploitation of land and natural resources, where the Dutch implemented forced labor systems, such as the Cultuurstelsel cultivation system. This system required local farmers to cultivate specific crops, like coffee and sugar, exclusively for export. As a result, the local economy began to serve European interests directly, causing great suffering among communities whose subsistence and way of life were disrupted. With the implementation of these oppressive economic policies, the cultural and spiritual practices of local communities also suffered a gradual erosion. The Dutch worldview, heavily influenced by European Christianity, often disregarded or even demonized Indonesian spiritual traditions, labeling them as pagan or primitive. This imposition of foreign values was especially intense in areas where Dutch colonization was more prominent, such as Java and the Maluku Islands. Temples, religious practices, and rituals were devalued and, in some cases, even banned, delivering a deep blow to the spiritual identity of communities. For many of these communities, the loss of spiritual and cultural autonomy was one of the most devastating aspects of colonization. Spirituality, which had once connected people with nature and their ancestors, was gradually replaced by a religious and cultural framework that did not belong to them. Although Islam had already spread through several regions of Indonesia before the Dutch arrived, it coexisted harmoniously with animist and Hindu practices. However, colonial imposition sought to reshape the spiritual landscape according to a Western Christian view, generating cultural and identity conflicts that resonate to this day. Cultural expressions, such as dance, music, and architecture, were also deeply impacted. Traditional practices were discouraged, and many customs were either replaced or adapted to suit European tastes. Dance and music, once expressions of identity and spirituality, lost part of their symbolic value and were transformed into entertainment for colonial elites. These practices, which previously connected communities to their ancestors and the spiritual realm, were modified and commercialized, weakening their cultural importance and alienating people from their own traditions. Despite these attempts at cultural suppression, many Indonesian communities resisted, preserving their traditions in discreet ways. Small rural communities continued practicing their rituals and teaching traditions to the younger generations, silently defying the imposed cultural dominance. This cultural resistance became a symbol of resilience and pride, and while weakened, Indonesia's cultural identity survived. Colonization did not fully destroy the spirituality and cultural practices of communities, which found ways to adapt and endure over time. This subtle yet resilient resistance would prove crucial to the independence movement that would emerge later. The cultural and spiritual identity of Indonesian communities, which had been threatened by colonization, became a unifying force in the desire to reclaim autonomy and respect for ancestral traditions. In the next chapter, we'll explore the strategies of cultural resistance that arose during colonization and how these practices helped keep Indonesian identity alive up to independence. Cultural resistance and preservation of traditions. Although Dutch colonization sought to impose a new cultural and spiritual order, Indonesian communities demonstrated remarkable resilience, finding ways to preserve their traditions. Cultural resistance was often subtle, manifesting through everyday practices that kept ancestral identity alive. These communities understood that to protect their roots, they needed to adapt to the circumstances while keeping their cultural legacy intact within the limits imposed by the colonizers. In this way, Indonesians resisted cultural erasure in intelligent and often invisible ways, unnoticed by their occupiers. One of the most effective mechanisms for cultural preservation was the continuation of spiritual traditions and rituals, performed privately or within smaller communities, far from areas under direct colonial control. In Java, for instance, Islam was adopted and adapted in ways that incorporated elements of local animist and Hindu beliefs, creating a syncretic form of Islam that stayed true to Javanese cultural values. This approach allowed spirituality to be preserved, albeit in an adapted form, enabling communities to continue practicing their ancestral traditions while appearing to comply with imposed religious changes. Language preservation was also a fundamental act of cultural resistance. In many communities, the use of local languages and dialects became a means of maintaining social cohesion and cultural identity. Although Dutch was imposed as the administrative and educational language in some areas, native languages like Javanese, Sundanese, and Balinese continued to be spoken and passed down through generations. This allowed oral traditions, stories, and ancestral values to endure, even amidst pressure to adopt colonial culture. Art and music played crucial roles in preserving Indonesian identity as well. Traditional dances and music, such as those performed on the gamelan, were discreetly transmitted during family gatherings and local celebrations. Although the colonizers tried to transform these expressions into entertainment for elite audiences, communities continued to use them as forms of cultural expression and resistance. Indonesian dance and music not only entertained, but also strengthened a sense of belonging and conveyed cultural values across generations. Informal education also became a powerful tool for cultural resistance. In many villages, families passed down traditional knowledge, including farming techniques, artisan skills, and principles of community organization. This knowledge, which reflected the pre-colonial Indonesian way of life and worldview, allowed communities to maintain a level of autonomy within colonial rule, preserving practices that strengthened their cultural and spiritual identity. This quiet cultural resistance became a pillar of Indonesian identity and laid the groundwork for the independence movements of the 20th century. The preservation of traditions, even under pressure, reinforced a sense of national identity and provided Indonesians with a solid foundation for their struggle for autonomy. In the next chapter, we'll explore how the legacy of this pre-colonial culture is still present in modern Indonesia and continues to shape society today. Legacy of pre-colonial culture in modern Indonesia. Despite enduring centuries of colonization, the essence of pre-colonial Indonesian culture still resonates in modern life, particularly in the traditions, spiritual practices, and cultural expressions that have withstood the test of time. This legacy is visible in many aspects of daily Indonesian life, where ancestral values and cultural practices continue to shape society and national identity. For many Indonesians, these cultural elements are not merely distant memories, but rather foundational pillars that sustain their worldview and connection to their heritage. A clear example of this heritage is the continuity of spiritual and ceremonial practices. In Bali, for instance, the concept of Tri-Hida Karana, a principle that represents balance among God, humans, and nature, continues to influence many aspects of local life. This philosophy still guides temple architecture, village planning, and daily practices for the Balinese, preserving a connection between humans and their environment. Ceremonies celebrating everything from harvest to life milestones maintain this spiritual link with nature, serving as reminders of respect and harmony with the universe. In the arts, traditional dances and music remain vibrant cultural expressions. The gamelan orchestra in traditional dances, such as kikak and barong, are still performed regularly for both locals and visitors from around the world. While some of these practices have become part of the tourism industry, they retain profound spiritual and cultural significance for Indonesians. These artistic rituals continue to convey ancestral values and express Indonesian identity authentically, reinforcing cultural continuity amidst modern transformations. Local languages have also endured and are still widely spoken across various regions in the country. Regional dialects, such as Javanese and Sundanese, are used daily and celebrated as essential parts of local identity. This ongoing use of native languages preserves a unique worldview that maintains the values and perspectives of pre-colonial Indonesia, allowing new generations to forge a direct connection with their roots. Additionally, the community-oriented mindset, based on Gotong Royong, the concept of mutual cooperation and collective work, remains a deeply respected value across the country. During both times of celebration and hardship, helping one another is a deeply embedded characteristic of Indonesian society. This spirit of solidarity, which existed long before colonization, strengthens local communities and fosters a sense of national unity, even within such a vast and diverse country. The legacy of pre-colonial Indonesian culture is not just a tribute to the past, but a foundation for the future, ensuring that future generations feel pride in their heritage. In the next chapter, we'll reflect on the importance of preserving this cultural and spiritual heritage, understanding how it can strengthen national identity and inspire continued appreciation for Indonesia's cultural roots. The importance of cultural preservation for the future. Preserving Indonesia's cultural and spiritual heritage is not only a way of honoring the past, but also a means of building a stronger, more conscious future. In an increasingly globalized world, where cultures blend and external influences expand rapidly, keeping cultural and spiritual traditions alive helps preserve identity and social cohesion. For Indonesia, where each island and community has its own history, language, and customs, cultural preservation is essential to ensure that this diversity continues to enrich the nation and strengthen national pride. One of the primary benefits of cultural preservation is educating younger generations. Knowing their history and ancestral values provides young Indonesians with a solid foundation for understanding and respecting the origins of their culture. In Bali, for example, traditional dances, language, and community rituals are part of the education of children and adolescents. This knowledge allows young Indonesians to identify with their heritage, fostering a sense of belonging and respect for the traditions that shape the nation. This awareness generates deep respect for the past and motivates the continuation of these practices into the future. Cultural preservation also fosters appreciation for Indonesia's internal diversity. With more than 17,000 islands and hundreds of ethnic groups, the archipelago is one of the most culturally diverse countries in the world. Keeping traditions, languages, and practices alive promotes social harmony and unity that respects each group's individuality. This mutual respect is vital for social stability, allowing different cultures to coexist and cooperate without imposing a single, centralized identity. In addition to strengthening national identity, cultural preservation benefits the country economically, particularly through tourism. Many visitors are drawn to Indonesia to experience its unique traditions, witness dances and rituals, and explore ancient temples. This cultural tourism generates a vital source of income for local communities, encouraging them to maintain and value their ancestral practices. However, for this appreciation to be genuine, it is crucial that these cultural practices are preserved not just as tourist attractions, but as a part of daily life in communities. Therefore, cultural preservation is a collective responsibility and a way of ensuring that Indonesia continues to thrive without losing sight of its roots. Promoting the teaching of local languages, supporting initiatives to preserve traditional dances and ceremonies, and encouraging respect for spirituality are ways to ensure that future generations find a country that, while modern, remains connected to its past. In the final chapter, we'll conclude this journey with a reflection on the importance of valuing traditional cultures and an invitation for the viewer to deepen their understanding and appreciation of cultural heritage worldwide. Throughout this video, we have delved into Indonesia's cultural and spiritual roots before Dutch colonization, exploring the richness of traditions that shaped the country's identity. We've seen how spirituality, art, social organization, and trade flourished throughout the archipelago, and how this cultural heritage bravely endured despite the pressures and transformations brought by colonialism. Studying pre-colonial Indonesia allows us to appreciate a society that, long before European arrival, had developed a vibrant and cohesive identity grounded in values that continue to resonate today. Preserving this heritage is more than a tribute to the past. It is a way to ensure that future generations maintain an authentic connection with their origins. By understanding and respecting these traditions, we gain an opportunity to build a future that values cultural diversity and mutual respect. Indonesian culture is not merely a distant memory. It is a living part of modern life, an anchor of identity that continues to enrich and inspire those within the archipelago and anyone fortunate enough to explore it. At this point, it's essential to reflect on the role each of U.S. plays in cultural preservation, not just in Indonesia, but for cultures worldwide. Every tradition, language, and art form represents a unique view of the world and an understanding of human existence. Valuing these cultural expressions is, in essence, valuing humanity itself, with all its diversity and beauty. Thus, cultural preservation becomes a shared responsibility, where every gesture of respect and appreciation helps keep alive the stories and traditions that shape the identities of peoples and nations. As we conclude, we invite you to continue this journey of cultural discovery, whether in Indonesia or beyond. By exploring and sharing these stories, we contribute to the transmission of ancestral knowledge and to the strengthening of cultural identity in each individual. Subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and share this video to help others learn about the richness of pre-colonial Indonesia. In valuing and preserving the past, we take an essential step toward building a future where cultural diversity is always respected and celebrated.